Thanks everyone for coming out this evening. On behalf of Columbia's Adaptation Initiative, I'd like to welcome you all to this event commemorating the launch of the Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes. My name is Radley Horton. I'm a climate scientist here at Columbia University and co-lead with Lisa Goddard the Adaptation Initiative here at Columbia, which is sponsoring this event. So I'm feeling to be on the stage here as we'll be hearing about an event, a center with so much momentum behind it. I think it's going to be a really exciting discussion. And with that in mind, I'm going to keep my remarks pretty brief. I see my role in the opening sort of couple minutes here to set a broader context, reminding us of the hazards, growing hazards in many ways that our cities face. As we learn more about how quickly climate change is happening and how vulnerable our systems are to those changes. But also I think we can increasingly point to signs of hope in terms of really ramping up of not just greenhouse gas mitigation efforts, but also on the side of adaptation and resilience in the broader world, here at Columbia and at the interface in the places that this new center highlights. So to quickly run through a few of those things, as a climate scientist, I'll just sort of quickly note things that we're all hearing about in the news. Sea level rise does appear to be happening faster than we thought, especially as we look out to the year 2100 or so. We hear this continuing narrative of a ramping up of the sea level rise projections, more and more evidence that we can't rule out some extreme scenarios of maybe 2 meters of sea level rise in a worst case scenario or more. That has profound impacts, not just on the amount of flooding, the area flooded during an event, but on the frequency with which we experience everything from catastrophic flooding to the types of nuisance flooding events that can really undermine so many of our systems. But it's not just sea level rise and coastal flooding. We're learning more about how vulnerable we are to extreme heat, and especially extreme heat in the context of higher humidity as well. This is another emerging research area where we're learning about just how vulnerable, as those combinations of temperature and humidity rise, people are, what additional demands it presents on our energy system to try to keep those people cool, and how if you start to get high enough in terms of temperature and humidity, everybody is vulnerable, even if they're in perfect health, have an endless supply of water and shade available. So these are real challenges we face. We're learning, of course, how heavy rain events appear to be increasing in a warming climate much faster than climate models suggested they would. Yet another example, like with sea level rise, where our observations, our science and our understanding is trying to keep up with what we're actually observing. Major threats in that regard in the context of cities. How do we capture that water? How do we avoid the worst kinds of flooding? Certainly drought, something that's in the news so much now as we think of the next Adaptation Futures Conference scheduled for this June in Cape Town, a city facing extreme threats and the sort of most dire reports of even sort of running out of water. So how do we prepare? How can we be resilient in the face of these types of challenges? We're learning more and more about how each of those types of extreme events that I just mentioned also can be correlated in space and time. We can't view them independently. We can't think about the sea level rise problem separately from the rainfall, inland flooding problem. As the oceans rise, even if storms don't get any stronger, coastal surges move further and further inland, and when it rains inland, it's harder for that rainfall to make its way to the ocean as those oceans are higher. How do we prepare for those correlated risks across extreme events? Another emerging area as we think about resilience is how do we prepare for the climate changes in remote regions? Is it enough just to prepare for climate change we expect in our city? In an integrated world with supply chain risks, food security challenges, conflict and migration, how do we think about resilience in one place in the context of the changing world and changing climate globally? All some of the big questions I think that we face and challenges as we think about resilience going forward. But as I said, this isn't just, or even primarily, I think, a story about negativity and growing risk and vulnerability, because we can really honestly say that we are seeing more and more signs of stepping up to this challenge, I think. It's maybe a little more understood on the greenhouse gas mitigation side, how we're doing that as a society. I think we're all hearing about how gradually the price of some renewables is reaching or even exceeding, in terms of parity, cost of some traditional fossil fuels. That suggests the potential for rapid changes. Certainly doesn't guarantee it, but suggests there's the potential for shifting to a world of more renewables. But likewise, I think we're also seeing signs in terms of articulating and acknowledging the climate vulnerabilities we face and adapting, preparing for those changes which are inevitable. We see this more and more in terms of private sector engagement, money being invested on adaptation, on resilience. We see it in terms of requirements of risk disclosure that are expected more and more of companies. We see it arguably in the lawsuits that we're hearing more and more about, threatening to try at least to link fossil fuel majors and some countries to these climate extremes that we're observing more and more. And I would just note that the success of those lawsuits won't necessarily be the primary determinant of their impact. There are reputational risks and feedbacks there potentially that I think you can make the case could lead to rapid change. So that's sort of the broader context globally of how I think there are some signs of hope in terms of preparing more and more, testing new strategies for resilience in the face of the climate changes we're locked into. In the smaller world of Colombia, certainly through the climate campaign, we're seeing a major initiative, major attention to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, pursuing technologies that lead to rapid reductions in emissions and capture carbon from the atmosphere. Also focused within the university on extreme events, on sea level rise, and applying this interdisciplinary perspective, going beyond the climate science to ask what the major levers are in society. How can the law be brought to bear to help think about some of these climate challenges? Public policy, economics, communication, anthropology, recognizing that we need this interdisciplinary approach to face these types of challenges. And within the Adaptation initiative at the Earth Institute, we're adopting a lot of these philosophies as well, taking that interdisciplinary approach, expanding the dialogue. What does resilience, what does adaptation mean to different communities within the university? How can we all partner together in the face of these challenges? Some of the things we're doing are coming together for reading seminars where we share the key papers to help us understand what each other do. Focusing in on the key areas where we want to work together in the future. Retreat, for example, managed retreat emerging as a major theme that, like it or not, is bound to be discussed more and more. How can we be proactive about it? How can we talk about it in a way that benefits as many segments of society as possible? Also engaging around other major themes we're going to be hearing about tonight. Testing urban adaptation strategies. To what extent can best practices among leading practitioner cities be applied to other cities? To what extent are these lessons not transferable? Thinking about the role of green infrastructure and ecology in adaptation, natural capital services as we think about climate change and meeting human development needs in the context of ecosystems as well. Those are a lot of the things that we're working on in terms of the Adaptation initiative. You may notice some of the challenges here. It's so open-ended. How do you define adaptation? Which climate hazards do you think about first? Who defines the priorities of the future? How do we think about how local context varies? How do we think about pre-existing injustices in society as we think about adaptation? It becomes very theoretical in a hurry. It's so critical to have applied, specific, on-the-ground incubator projects we can work on. And that's where I want to seg to the exciting new center we're going to hear about here, because what we have here is something very real, something very practical, something very much in the line of the new thinking around Columbia World projects that we're all hearing about more in Columbia, taking that science and applying it to action, the real world of implementation, how decisions are made. How do we test resilient strategies? How do we build new partnerships that include everything from the science to the design to the investment? Those are some of the topics that we're going to be hearing about today as we hear about the really exciting work of the center. I don't want to take any more time. I'd like to turn it over to Courtney Smith now, and thanks again for giving us the opportunity to join with you on this event tonight.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Courtney Smith. I'm a program associate at the Rockefeller Foundation, and I've really been helping to support the creation of the center and also its inaugural project, the Resilience Accelerator, through the side of the Rockefeller Foundation. There we go. And I'm really excited to be here to celebrate the launch of this new center, which really represents this new era of breaking down silos across the academic institution and applying the research and incredible thinking of Columbia University to real world problems and addressing challenges of resilience worldwide. The Rockefeller Foundation has been really excited to be a part of this, and we have been investing in the resilience field for over a decade and more than $500 million through place-based design initiatives, institutional partnerships with the federal government, and through global networks of practice, such as the 100 Resilient Cities Network. And as we're considering our next era of investment at the Foundation in resilience, our focus is going to be on the 100 Resilient Cities Network and focus on implementation in cities throughout the globe. And this new center, as well as its inaugural project, the Resilience Accelerator, really represents an opportunity to apply the decades worth and thinking that the Foundation has been a part of to addressing resilience challenges worldwide. So we're really excited to be here and really excited to see that the resources from our grant have been helped to support the launch of this new center at Columbia. And we're excited to see how it continues to advance the work of the resilience field moving forward. Now, I'm going to invite up Sam Carter to talk about the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative and the Resilience Accelerator.
Thank you. Look at this, so many people. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Sam Carter. I am a director at 100 Resilient Cities, and I'm also leading this partnership between 100 RC and Columbia. And I'm going to try to tease out a little bit of what this partnership looks like and how the 100 RC program is evolving through this partnership. Radley really scared us. You know, he talked about all these scary things that are going to happen. I will try to start off on a little bit more of an optimistic note, which is that we are becoming more urban every day as a civilization. Right now, about 50% of our population lives in cities. In about 20 years, it's going to be closer to 75%. And that's only going to go up. And as we add more and more people to the world, our cities are going to get bigger and denser. And some studies estimate that 75% of the cities of the future by 2050 haven't been built yet, the infrastructure and the buildings. And so as we think about the opportunity and why Rockefeller and other people are so focused on cities and sort of the urban moment right now, it's because we actually have the opportunity to build safer cities, more resilient cities into the future if we are really thoughtful about how we think about the decisions that we're making now. And that's really at the core of what the Foundation is thinking and doing with the 100 Resilient Cities program, is how can we put into place today a planning process and a capacity within cities all over the world to be able to get ahead of those future challenges, to be able to make decisions today and investments and plans that actually set a path for sustainable and safe and resilient growth over time. The 100 Resilient Cities program started about 5 years ago. As the name suggests, there's 100 cities in the network. And we've brought them online over the course of a series of waves. We had sort of 3 waves of competitive challenges where cities had to, put in an application and compete to be part of the network. And what the cities get when they're part of this program is essentially 4 things. The first is a chief resilience officer. So we fund 2 years of their salary. This is a senior official within the city government that is responsible for coordinating across all the different government entities and, you know, working with communities to develop a strategy and then implement against that strategy to become resilient. The second programmatic component is that strategy, so we provide them technical assistance and consulting services in order to develop the strategy. That's everything from modeling to community outreach to, you know, planning and design workshops. They also get to be part of a network, so each Chief Resilience Officer has 99 colleagues that they can pick up a phone and learn about what they're doing and hear from them, and so we structure learning and network engagement opportunities for our cities. And we also form partnerships like this one with Columbia, where we create opportunities for private, public, not-for-profit organizations to work with cities to actually implement against their strategies. So as I said, there's 100 cities in the network. When we were, you know, selecting the cities as part of this, you know, sort of experiment, we had a portfolio lens when we were thinking about which cities we wanted to put in. So it's a real range of smaller cities to very large mega cities. And our goal in selecting the portfolio was to make sure that any city in the world could see themselves in at least one other city in that. So we really tried to maximize across the typology to hit a bunch of different works. And we're doing this very much as our own experiment, so we're learning about what works in different places and what techniques and strategies work in different cities, and we're trying to improve as we go along. So these cities go through a process. They hire a Chief Resilience Officer, they work with communities to develop a strategy, they publish the strategy, and then what? You have a beautiful plan that's nicely laid out, and it could very well sit on a shelf and nothing could happen with it. So as we move into a new era at 100RC where we've put out about 40 strategies, by the end of this year we'll have 70 out, by the end of next year we'll have them all out, we are thinking as an organization how we might more actively support the implementation of these strategies. So if you open up one of these strategies, there's like 100 projects in each one of them, and they range from, you know, a new, you know, neighborhood or district level redevelopment project to a new housing buyout project or policy, and so it's a whole mix of stuff, and we're trying to think, what can we do to really support these cities to do this difficult work? One of the things that we've learned from watching things like the Rebuild by Design process here in New York, if you guys are familiar with that, is that you can have a great design, you can have exciting ideas, you can have an engaged community, and then when it hits implementation, it's like, ugh, what is this? And the city gets it, and they're like, what is this? You know, and so it's actually hard to implement these projects because resilience projects represent a different way of thinking about space, a different way of thinking about bureaucracy and permitting. You know, something that looks like a park project is actually a flood protection project, and who manages that and who's responsible for that. So we really have to think and work creatively with cities on how to do this. Which brings us to this program, the Resilience Accelerator. So the grant that Courtney alluded to is a $3.7 million grant that the foundation generously made to form this partnership between Columbia University's Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes and the 100 Resilient Cities program. And what it will allow us to do is for some number of the thousands of initiatives that are in our strategies that are coming out, we're going to go really deep. We're going to work closely with the cities and the city officials and the implementing partners to really push these designs and really set them up so that they can be effectively implemented. And what this really leverages is these two unique capacities of the two institutions. So on one hand, we've spent 5 years at 100 Resilient Cities forming these deep, close relationships with cities around the world. We have a sense of trust. We know what their priorities are. We've gone through a process with them. We have a strategy that everyone's aligned around, and we understand what their needs and what their limited capacities are. And on the other hand, with a great institution like Columbia and the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation and this new center, we have creative ideas, we have thinkers, we have new ideas, we have students, we have expertise in research, planning, design practice. And what we want to do is marry these two things so that we can bring the most creative thinking, the best design practice to bear on the critical needs and urgencies of the cities in our network. So essentially what we do, we bring together creative minds, diverse resources to improve, accelerate, and implement resilience projects in order to better the lives of people in cities. And Kate's going to talk a little bit more about the mechanics of sort of how this is going to work at the center. But at the end of the day, we're trying to do stuff. And so we're going to be looking across the portfolio of all the strategies in the 100 RC network. We're actually going to be asking cities to tell us a little bit more about what they need. And we're going to be looking for these moments, whether it's sort of, you know, there's an idea, but it's not really a concept, or maybe you have a concept, but it needs definition, or maybe you have a project, but it really needs some design work. And we're going to convene, we're going to crowd in resources, and we're going to move things forward. And across all these different interventions, we're going to be trying to grow the resilience value. We're going to try to leverage as many different resources as possible. So we're going to work with the cities and the project teams to make sure that they're, you know, squeezing every last dollar out of their various programs and how they're spending money, and find creative and innovative ways to finance the projects. We're going to use it to engage people and build advocacy. We want champions for these projects to make sure that they actually get implemented well. And we want to make sure that they're actually set up to have impact on people's lives. So we call that design for impact. So cities have identified these projects. We want to help them get closer to implementation. And with that, I'll pass it off to my great partner, Kate. So Kate Orff is the new director of this center. And she's going to talk a little bit about how that's going to work. Thanks so much, Kate.
Thank you very much, and I am just very, very excited to announce the formation of this center and really celebrate it with everybody here tonight. It's a great day for GSAP to really kind of be so embedded and integrated into all this amazing work and continue our kind of passion and engagement through the form of the center. I'd also like to thank Radley, Horton, and Lisa Goddard for their leadership with the Columbia Climate Adaptation Initiative. It's really been extraordinary to work with such dynamic and open and generous colleagues. And also to thank Professor Michael Girard and also Stephen Cohen, who, with their leadership over the past year at the Earth Institute, have really kind of set the groundwork for something like this to happen. I'd also like to thank our Dean, Amal Andraus, for her support. So first, what does this mean? Why, if we're talking about resilience and this kind of breaking silos and this sort of need to think about the future of cities and landscapes and places that we live relative to climate and other shocks and stressors in the next century, what does this mean for design, and what does this mean for Columbia as an institution? So to go a little bit into more detail about the actual grant itself, we're very excited. It's a 30-month partnership, and what will this grant will enable is not only internal courses and education around the thematic of resilience, such as very specific seminar program related to risk and resilience, or seminar programming related to the themes, some of these themes that Sam mentioned, that many of these cities are sharing specific challenges. How can we, through the lens of the seminar, compare and contrast and build a kind of case study network for these challenges? In the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, Preservation, we also run design studios, which are much broader, investigative, very applied design iterations where we can begin to workshop some of these challenges that have been self-identified by the cities themselves. And we are also aiming for a future certificate program, in addition to all the other things that Sam already mentioned, which is connecting Columbia students and faculty to this massive global network of experts, institutions, and resilience leaders worldwide. And so in addition to that, we have a number of opportunities for faculty outside GSAP to sort of plug in and lead seminars. And so we're really excited that this is a sort of beginning of a much longer, broader partnership that we hope can help to cross some of these silos within the university. So design thinking combined with a resilience approach, I think, is at the core of what the center is aiming to bring. Literally, what is design thinking, right? Well, we've already heard about what resilience is and how that's been defined by Rockefeller. But design itself, I think, has a critical role to play in the next century. Something that I think is now, a unique aspect of maybe what I, as a landscape architect, and Thaddeus Pawlowski as a planner, kind of bring to this discussion is that, climate is not this abstract aspect. It really kind of translates into people and behavior, spatial contexts of cities and landscapes on the ground. So design has the power to synthesize, to be integrative, and to bring multiple perspectives into a kind of a very proactive, solutions-oriented dialogue. Secondly, design has the power to visualize not only data, but visualize future scenarios and to help cities think through some of these complex problems and the decisions that might accompany them. And then finally, at Columbia GSAP, we are very grounded in spaces and places where people live. So we bring this very iterative design approach, testing scenarios, and we bring it down and we integrate this very systems-driven approach together with literally how these systems integrate culturally within neighborhoods and places where people live. So this is the core objective of the center, is to integrate the resilience approach and design thinking. Another main goal is to connect across fields, and I'm so thrilled to have Professor Lall joining us for the discussion tonight with his groundbreaking work at the Water Center. We are really aiming to begin to bridge policy, engineering, design, and law, among many other factors, together at the university. And we have such strength, amazing strengths in these areas, that the theme of resilience itself is cross-cutting. And so our goal is really to begin to further push the format and methods for this cross-sector collaboration. And then, and to put a sort of finer grain on the goals of the center, we aim to not only design and by convening these immersive global workshops, either in the form of the Columbia studios or seminars, or in places around the world in these 100 resilient cities, and advance strategy and project design with a whole network of subject matter experts, connect, again, a network of creative thinkers and technical experts to the cities that so desperately are in need of creative and adaptation. And then finally, to learn, really to sort of embed resilience thinking within Columbia's GSAP through these reinvented seminars, studio curriculum, and this future certificate. So what's Thad and I are working on now is really to diversify how people can get involved, and we're so excited about the turnout tonight, and we hope to really begin to get back to you with very specific ways to get involved. First up, we have a Cities Challenge that's being launched on April 2nd. This is where, as Sam mentioned, cities have developed essentially a series of challenges, and now we're going to identify a smaller suite of potential projects that will then be paired with an accelerator. So we aim to bring together literally the cities, the projects, and sister institutions around the world, whether that's in Rio de Janeiro or Amman, Jordan, or any of these other amazing cities that will be working in. We are planning to launch the Faculty Challenge shortly thereafter, and aim to get expressions of interest and expertise for cross-sector seminars, such as something at the School of Law and the School of Architecture around this theme of resilience or retreat, for example. And then we also have 3 associate research scholar positions that we're aiming to, that will be posted this week, and that will help to sort of build our team and move the center forward. So we're very excited about those initial steps. And then, in addition to what's happening inside the Columbia frame, what's very exciting is the center will also aim to be convening these sort of more creative, scenario-driven workshops with global partners, such as the Asian Development Bank, in which these accelerators can help cities and places drive resilience value and help them articulate and get funding for their own projects. So we have the Asian Development Bank We have a partnership that we're launching with the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, where we're helping them advance this resilience model relative to this new management of coral reef systems that's really integrating people together with a specific reef system, rather than and sort of tying communities much more closely to the reefs and a sort of a new stewardship model. And then finally, as a sort of a subset of the advanced partnership, which is being led by Radley, we are beginning to work with the World Wildlife Fund to use the tools of design and planning to help at-risk communities and ecosystems in coastal Mozambique, an area which is facing, it's hard to imagine in this particular image, but massive liquid natural gas extraction that's threatening coastal fishing communities and threatening rather sudden urbanization on shore. So as a team, I'm very thrilled to see so many GSAP faculty members here. Thank you for coming, and so many students. And I guess we're just really very excited to be part of this much broader university-wide initiative. And I think together we can all see Columbia's true potential in this area of thought and in this area of applied practice. So that's my remarks, and I'll turn it over to Thaddeus, and I'm excited to join the panel.
We're going to keep this panel short because we want to get to a reception afterwards. I think Kate highlighted that a lot of this work has to do with building the network, and so we want all of you to feel that you're a part of that network. You are a part of that network now, and we want you to get to know each other and maybe ask us and others in the room questions. We're all interested in the same things. So I'm going to, I'm Thaddeus Pawlowski, by the way. I'm the managing director of this new center, and I teach at GSAP. I teach urban design and urban planning. So I'm going to lead a few questions for our panelists here. And the first question I have, we've been using this term resilience a lot, and I'd like to know, and we all have sort of a different definition of it. Engineers talk about it one way. Public health people talk about it in another way. So I'd like to hear from each of you what this word means to you, and if you use it in your work, and how you use it, and if maybe start by just telling us, especially you, Manu, because we didn't get to give you a formal introduction before. Maybe we could start with you, and you could tell us a little bit about your work here, and then talk about the resilience theme.
Okay, thanks very much for asking me to join today. I was actually going to throw it back as a question to the audience. Mm-hmm. Do you think Bugs Bunny was robust or resilient? Which one is it? Does it matter? We know that he's still around, right? No matter what happens and all kinds of extremes that Radley could throw at him, Bugs Bunny will be there and thrive. But yeah, so since no one seems to want to answer that or take it as a serious question, that's my definition of resilience, by the way, make you think about it at least. So coming to brass tacks, the way engineers have described resilience, and these definitions go back perhaps to the 1940s, is the amount of a system's resilience is measured by the amount of time it takes to restore full function after a failure. Okay, this is like textbook definition of the whole thing. Now, no one tells you what a system is, or what recovery means here, or anything like that. And to play engineer in a box, I'll throw another thing out at you. One of the popular things now, which is symbolized by green infrastructure, for example, is the notion that nature has figured out how to do some things, and if we follow that, we will do it well. So that's another sort of paraphrasing of the way that resilience could come across. So let's think about what happens with you as a human being. You eat, and sometime later that stuff comes out, right? That implies that there has to be some storage in the system, otherwise you'd be doing, stuff all the time. Okay, so now if you think about that, and you think about water, that storage could come in this form of a big concrete tank, or it could come for floods through green infrastructure, which is some landscape element that unobtrusively captures that storage. But does that get us to resilience? It's not altogether clear, because if I use the original definition I gave you, the engineered concrete box will fail. If it fails badly enough, it might take us a long time to rebuild a new box, not because of the technology needed, but because of all the people talking about whether you needed that box in the first place and who's going to pay for it, right? On the landscape side, it could be that you actually experience failure very often because it floods, okay? But is that really failure? Because did it impact someone or not? If it impacted someone, it is failure, and it will happen. And then those people will probably go back, if you're in a developing country, and go back and live right exactly there again, right? So these are, I'm trying to answer your question without actually answering it. How's that?
Okay, that's great.
Okay, I'll speak a little bit to, I mean, maybe how, I think how resilience has impacted design professions, and particularly urban design and landscape architecture. Definitely in the face of climate and thinking about climate uncertainty and resilience, we all have changed the way that we've worked very radically, I would say, in the last 5 years, 5 to 10 years. And I think what's critical is that, you know, landscape architecture, maybe in the age of Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park here, he had a lot on his mind. There were, you know, in addition to thinking about public health and water capture and, you know, creating large civic space for democracy, this is a kind of emerging democratic city and a nation to kind of test and occupy. That landscape had also kind of been trapped very much in almost an aesthetic decoration, if you will, of the modern city. And I think what's very exciting about resilience, and not thinking about just landscape architecture or urban design as such, is that we have to think much more broadly about the systems that create underlie our landscape. So, you know, literally the coral reef systems, the mangrove systems that protect our coast, the oyster reef systems, the systems of water capture and storage that simply used to be healthy soils that would absorb stormwater. So all those systems have so dramatically changed that we need to think, obviously, differently in a much more interconnected way. And so I think what's radical in the field of landscape is that I feel like landscape is now almost a matter of life and death and the way that we're thinking about it, in the sense that we can imagine coastal flooding combined with extreme storm weather events, literally creating pinch points for humans living on the edge of incredibly vulnerable cities around the world. And so these systems are under threat, and we cannot simply treat them as sort of abstractions or as givens. They need to be actively cultivated and remade. And of course, on the urban design side too, I think in the past decades, you know, urban design has been kind of maybe conceived as sort of arranging architecture relative to public spaces and creating kind of spaces for civic life to unfold within a sort of a built-up city. And that is still incredibly important, but it also has changed quite radically, in that now we are looking in a more precise way at the systems of waste, at the systems of water, at the sort of social systems and transport systems that underlie the kind of complexity of how literally future systems future cities are emerging, and understanding that it goes much more beyond the unit of the building. So resilience, I think, has forced us also to think forwards in a way that and to think about how our built environment interfaces in a very direct way with the natural environment in a way that maybe we have, frankly, ignored for decades.
And you, Radley?
I'll just add a little. I think just to highlight these points about complexity and uncertainty, just to define resilience in ways that can account for surprises, can account for adaptability, that have this sort of multi-sectoral framework. For example, when we're trying to think about the extreme heat events of the future, we need to simultaneously be thinking about how vegetation is going to respond in a hotter planet, in a drier planet in some cases. We'll have new vegetation that itself may impact the extremes of temperature and humidity as one example. So how do we plan for that system complexity? We're never going to have perfect predictions. How can we build bottom-up approaches to resilience that are answering the questions of resilient for whom, resilient for as many people as possible, resilient across these systems that Kate just mentioned, and resilient in the face of some inevitable large uncertainties, even as there are some things we know for sure. Sea levels are going to rise a lot. It's going to profoundly change flood risk. We're just never going to be able to say exactly how much the flood risk is going to change.
So if I may summarize, it's hard, right? It's quite a challenge building a resilient city or a resilient landscape. So what do we do? How do we approach these problems? And where are the gaps in our tool set now as you see them in your own practices? And what do you think some of the major barriers are to, say, adopting a more systems approach to planning infrastructure, or thinking about landscape as a life and death proposition, the way that we plan our land use? And how do you feel that your work or your professional mission could benefit from more tools or more means of collaboration?
You want to start with me again? Okay.
Well, whoever feels.
Okay.
Yes.
I think this is a really interesting question, and I think wherever there's complexity and uncertainty, that doesn't necessarily mean the solutions are complex or uncertain. Mm-hmm. It's the exposure you're getting to what you design, that has those issues that you have to deal with. So, for example, picking up on water, I would say the biggest obstacle, as I was sort of hinting at before, is the social system, the institutional system, rather than the technical side. And the reason I say that is that let's take one example, which is that we choose to take urban systems where 75% of the water that is distributed for whatever use is captured, treated, and reused. Okay, let's look at the implications of something like that. It would reduce our take from the water bodies that we take water from, which means that what is left there is better for ecology, hopefully, unless there are other disturbances, which could always be the case. It also reduces what we discharge to the environment, because it's now much easier to capture the remnant and do something with it. It also potentially reduces combined sewer overflow issues, because you have more capacity for storing floodwaters or rainfall stuff. So all that sounds good. So why is it that you don't see it? Right? Now, one of the reasons is that the way the industry started out trying to do this is they came up with an initiative called From Toilet to Tap, and they had a nice blonde woman trying to drink from a toilet. Okay, so that's a communication issue. But more importantly, I think the issue that we have is, imagine a utility such as New York City, and suppose I came up with a little device that all you had to do was stick it in your house, and it took your wastewater, treated it, and gave it back to you. So now it's not somebody else's toilet, it's your own toilet. So maybe you're a little, okay with that compared to somebody else. But if you started doing that, then the business model goes to someone who's selling that device and maintains that device, and New York City's revenue basically crashes, and their happiness with you will be simply not there. So there is a built-in objection to change, and that I think is one of the biggest obstacles to achieving resilience, even though I gave you all those good reasons for why you should do that particular example.
I think to pick up on that, the scales seem to also be this seems to be just a critical theme for resilience, right? The sense that the notion of kind of localization of some of these kind of critical systems and the ability to adapt and steward the system at a localized scale seems to be absolutely key. And just to, I see some Columbia students here who were studying in Varanasi in India on the Ganges, and we've seen some of this systemic water collapse literally firsthand by touring the water system at a certain moment when it went from a sort of kind of neighborhood-based stewardship model around a kind of kund or tank system to literally during the colonial era being piped underground and having this tap water system that literally undercut what was on the surface. So we can't exactly go towards the past, but I think what we can imagine is maybe some new hybrids of future systems that are learning from some of these past models that were driven or fostered by social life and a different kind of form of social life, and kind of trying to pair or piggyback them together with what we have seen as this kind of much more modern example. I mean, another example that Thaddeus was just in Dominica, and there was an example of a solar-powered street light that were about 30 of them on their sides because of the hurricane there. So that kind of gives you a window into this need for the backup to the backup, or a need for a different kind of way of thinking about the scale of these kinds of systems.
Mm-hmm. The person I was with there pointed out that this was a good description of the difference between sustainability and resilience. And this might be a challenging idea, but the street lamp in itself might be a sustainable strategy that provides a constant source of power, but in itself, which is a great thing, but in itself, it's insufficient to the challenge of, Category 5 hurricane winds.
Mm-hmm. Just to quickly pick up on a few of the points, I think I agree with what Manu was saying about the social systems in some ways being the most challenging, and I think arguably one of the most sort of promising places to start in the face of these challenges, in terms of planning for the future, raising funds, developing the sort of political will to do these things. I think the participation element and the communication aspects too. So when hearing about the kind of workshops that are being envisioned, not having a top-down approach where you start with, here's the climate hazard, much as I did, but really sort of hearing, even before you turn to climate change, what are the existing issues in the community, values in the community, and then trying to find ways to interface the science with the existing needs. And I think in some cases really focusing on the communication, building up these messages and making them consistent with the very local sort of values and shared goals. Thinking about the role of students, a sort of younger generation, in pushing a lot of these methods forward. What role do we want there to be for advocacy? I think definitely something that needs to be thought about. Who are the thought leaders in these communities? How do we identify, some of the change forces? In some cases, will it be, industries, for example, that could play a leading role in some of their activities? But I think there's some things that can be done sort of very easily, maybe not relatively easily at local scales, that'll hopefully help start us on the path towards positive narratives as we think about some of the much bigger things that need to be done that may require things like changes in tax rates and things like that are harder to envision today. But I do think there are potential societal tipping points that could work in our favor, but we also have to be honest and acknowledge the fact that if we don't engage right away around mitigation and resilience issues, we really could lose control of this narrative. The scariest thing in a way is sort of a world where things have changed so fast that it's not so much an issue anymore of people denying that the climate is changing, for example, but sort of giving up hope on this narrative of shared solutions and working together towards towards getting out of these problems, which I think is still totally possible today. And it's just, we're just at this critical point, and initiatives like this can be so central to developing those participatory shared narratives around success and climate and these other hazards, changes.
Did you want to jump in, Kate, or no?
No, I agree.
I agree. Yeah, yes. For the second time, Radley has scared us tonight with the threat of.
I'm trying to get
Okay. But the widespread nihilism scenario is kind of frightening. That we might just give up. That collectively, and because the solutions seem so difficult. And some people have criticized the mission of adaptation, for instance, as saying we're already closing the door on trying to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. But it seems that we have to do both, and I think that we're all agreed on that. I want to focus just a little bit more on what we can do as an institution at Columbia. We are thrilled, of course, to be working with Rockefeller Foundation and 100 Resilient Cities, and especially in these other partners on these issues. But what do you think your professions, in particular, as engineers, landscape architects, climate scientists, could do better to collaborate? And we talked about communication a lot. We could go further onto the communication issue, but also are there gaps in the knowledge and the pathways to political action, or other specific instances of failure of communication?
That goes to you, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. So I would say that first, I'm really excited that the community at Columbia has decided to look at real world problems and do something about them, because this is the first step towards actually getting somewhere. And frankly, until maybe 2004 or 5, I had never done that. And then I started getting involved in these kind of things, and so now I'm asked to come and talk to you guys, right? So that's sort of where it ends up. But one aspect of it which I think gets overlooked is we talk about people with different expertise who need to talk to each other and communicate effectively to move forward. I don't actually think that works, or it works, but it requires a lot of effort, and it's not necessarily that productive an effort. What I've personally found to be useful is that if I'm trying to solve a real world problem, and there are legal elements to it, or financial elements to it, or science elements to it, I need to get sufficiently educated myself in that, so that when I'm talking to people who are experts in that, I can understand what they are talking about. If I do this as a matrix management exercise where each person, working like a consulting company is contributing expertise, I just don't think it works. You end up with suboptimal solutions of the worst sort.
And it's exacerbating the differences between the.
We all have to get a lot smarter and learn each other's vocabularies. I think that's part of it. Let me then jump to the educational aspect. And we are, so part of our mission, of course, as the university is to build knowledge, but also to disseminate it. What are some of the things that we could get better at teaching our students about, and particularly in our, as it relates to these separate fields?
Well, I think this notion of expanding your own expertise to understand the dialogue of the cluster of related disciplines relative to solving that issue is really key. At the same time, I kind of hold out hope in some way, and maybe it's because of this unit of the studio that exists. And if you're not in design school, it's basically a 9-credit unit, which is just quite an open, exploratory, time-intensive process where students work with each other and with faculty around issues or places around the world. So I do kind of hold out hope that maybe it's not the word, studio is not the right word, lab is not the right word, but maybe, and masterclass is not the right word. We have to find a new word for that. But I still kind of hold out hope that there might be some way that through the Climate Adaptation Initiative or others that there could be some of that very cross-disciplinary work that could happen within the space of the university itself, because in a way, students learning together alongside each other with these shared challenges seems to be great. And of course, we've piloted that in many different ways. There are individual courses around the university that have done that. We're in our Resilient Mozambique workshop, we're integrating with business school students and students from School of Architecture to look at natural capital, for example. But it seems to me that the challenges are so great and the silos are so strong, and the literally the academic framework the challenges of each individual school, whether it's law or engineering or policy the demands are so great for each of those degree problems that there's not a lot of free space, frankly, to speculate and to fail, frankly, and to experiment. And so, I mean, I think one of our longer term goals with the center and with the adaptation initiative we're doing at the faculty level now would be able to kind of infiltrate at least the master's level departments and groups with this kind of multi-actor, multi-sector challenges.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think just giving students the opportunity to be exposed to decision context, to sort of learn what's going on in agencies, to get to travel around the world and just experience empathy in some cases that might be hard to get until you actually see, in some cases, the real world implications of this, the challenges and the opportunities. I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that sort of empathy and experience component. Certainly as a climate scientist, for me, just having the chance to engage with city planners, for example, folks at DEP, MTA, and around the world, WWF and other contexts, just to really learn what the key decisions are, what are some of the ways that climate feeds into these broader questions is, I think, very illuminating. And if we can have that happen with more and more people at an earlier stage in their career, it can kind of help build that problem-based solving. I think, again, sort of referring back to Columbia World Projects within Columbia, the effort to really sort of from the beginning think about and work with groups like we're hearing about here that are working every day on actually solving real problems, engaging at the sort of existing points where decisions are made, and providing information that's useful from a bottom-up are all really valuable ways. And as you said, within the Adaptation Initiative, everything from the reading seminars to this conference that we're organizing around retreat, for example, are ways that we're envisioning having that discussion. Launching a new course on adaptation and resilience, but also, as Kate said, finding ways to build resilience more and more into existing courses, whether they're in the engineering department, business school, you name it, to help kind of expand these interdisciplinary approaches.
I mean, one further aspect of that is, I think the other critical thing, and Sam mentioned this in his remarks, is that a lot of the work, at least on the Rockefeller side, has been done in capacity building relative to 100 RC funding chief resilience officers in all of these cities and helping prioritize. But I think where we're all excited to dive in and to dig deep is that when you begin to, this doesn't hit the social aspect of what you mentioned, Radley, but when you begin to think about the physical city and beginning to ground these projects and literally in plan and section within a neighborhood, within a coastal system, then really some of those real world policy or decision points become very immediately clear. So I think it's that kind of grounding, at least in the physical sense of the city, some of these resilience challenges. I feel like that's really our goal, is to really advance them to the point where they can be forcing literally this decision-making context.
They become real and their impact on human life becomes evident. And yeah. Manu, did you?
I was just going to say, maybe in a way that, through design that inspires people, and that it enables, that helps sort of support visions of all that the city can be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe I can go back to the very beginning of this conversation. So, I mean, resilience is about us, right? It's not about some random group of animals that are out there, unless those animals are us. Mm-hmm. So, if you keep that in mind, then the challenge that you're working with in design and implementation is eliciting the goals of that set of people. And often, so I work also in decision theory and optimization quite a bit. Mm-hmm. So the thing that I find interesting is that the thread that has been there among social scientists rather than engineers is to look at multi-criteria decision making. Mm-hmm. And they say that we need to go and elicit the preferences of all the people, then those will become the objectives, a 100-dimensional objective that we'll optimize, and then we'll have a result. This doesn't work because most of those preferences are not well informed. So the first step is you have to actually educate these people so they understand what goes on. And there's precedent for this. The precedent comes from the RAND Corporation 1962. The the Delphi process. So what they do is they bring people together, and each of those stakeholders educates the other. So that's the process that we can go through, because unless that happens, we actually don't have a game, in terms of doing these things. So what I understand from the 100 Resilient Cities effort is that the resilience officers have been actually trying to understand what the stakeholders' perspectives are. So I think the next step would be to now entertain educational process across that set and for ourselves, because we don't know anything, frankly.
Just animals. Right?
Just animals. Well, maybe that's a good moment to open it up to the rest of you animals. I'm going to sort of randomly select a few questions from the audience.
Great. We have time for about 3 questions.
Maybe 3, yeah.
Three or 4 questions. Or
Anybody have
people have questions?
The gentleman in the green hat seemed to be first.
Hi. So one of the most tenuous systems we kind of rely on is our. Oh, thank you.
Maybe you can
So one of the most.
Yeah, could you also say who you are?
Oh yeah, sure, no problem. I'm Daniel Wall, and I'm in the MPA ESP program at SEPA. So the most tenuous system we kind of rely on is our food system. And we're talking a lot about resiliency in our landscape and things like that. And I'm wondering what kind of focus you're putting onto urban agriculture in a lot of the cities you're working on.
Do you want to take that?
I can take it.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Sam, here you go. Or you could go.
Oh, let's go.
Yeah.
Hi. So there's a couple ways to answer the question. There's and picking up on Manu's point, it's really about sort of what emerges from the process and what the priorities are of the people that we work with and the communities, balanced with political leadership and all the other things that are going on. But it's actually it wasn't as much of an issue in the first 2 to 3 years, but actually just in the past year and a half, it's become a sort of trending up issue for a lot of our groups. And there's some actually really amazing new tech startups that are getting a lot of VC money, like Bowery, and some other ones that are sort of really fundamentally transforming the way that cities may be able to produce food in the future using sensors and data technology that we're tracking at 100RC, and we're sort of exploring partnerships with them. But it's a fundamental issue. I mean, right here in New York City, if Sandy had hit about 12 hours earlier, none of us would have had food for about 2 weeks, because it would have completely inundated Hunts Point, which is a central point in this city where all of our food goes through. And if you talk about the issues of brittle systems, I mean, if we have a single food distribution point for an entire urban system, that's just not good. And so we'd end up having with food what we had with gas, sort of rationing and sort of lines, if you guys remember that, if you guys were here. So it's an issue that's critically important, and it's also one that is very exciting for me as someone who sort of is a place-based planning thinker. It also becomes an opportunity to connect the urban to the rural, if you're not talking about this technological system. So a lot of the work that we do when we do convenings, when we do workshops, is to try to define the boundaries of the systems that we're trying to wrap our heads around. And once you start introducing concepts like landscapes and ecology, then the city, which is the municipal unit, suddenly starts to get much bigger, and the map starts to look a lot more jagged than sort of a neat political circle. And so I think it's such a critical issue because everyone eats every day, and that it also drives, in many parts of the world, significant portions of the economy, that it's something that is popping up in our strategies and is a priority for our cities. I don't know if that was totally sufficient, but you can find me after the comments as well.
Yeah. I'll just chime in really quickly about the food issue. I mean, because I also don't, I mean, I wouldn't jump immediately from food systems to urban agriculture. I kind of definitely believe that these sort of robust fringe landscapes of our cities are this kind of new battleground. I mean, we witnessed in many places, for example, in Madurai in India, where literally because of the extraction of urban water dropping the water table, it meant that you could, instead of double cropping rice, you have single crop of rice. That meant that all of a sudden there was a massive influx of so-called rural dwellers into the city themselves. So I feel like one of the things would be to, and one of the challenges of this is to kind of acknowledge the complexity of the reciprocity between cities, landscapes, and systems, but then also to try to define, very kind of clear points of beginning in terms of an intervention or some sort of addressing that challenge.
Red sweater, third row. Let's see.
Hi. Hello. Yeah. Thank you. My name is Lindsay. I'm a MPA Development Practice student at SCAPE, and my question is, moving forward, acknowledging the intersectionality of climate change and the harm it inflicts on various communities and cities, how does this partnership plan to prioritize the resilience projects you plan on working on, and have you identified any specific indicators?
Yes.
And Sam,
Yeah, maybe you come on up, Sam,
All right,
because we've been working on this for Sam and Kate and I have been working on this for the last few months. Need is you can please join. You can just correct me if I get this wrong. Right. Well, we're trying to achieve the objectives that we laid out with this mutual understanding with Rockefeller Foundation and the 100 Resilient Cities, that we would target places where we could have impact. Places that have demonstrated need, where there's a gap that isn't otherwise being filled, and where we think we can really build capacity in the local institutions to be able to see these projects through. We don't want to helicopter into situations and just take off, and we want to build the capacity long-term to manage these projects and manage future projects. Anything else?
I think that's great, Thad. Just on a process or like a mechanics thing, Kate mentioned this challenge that we're putting out next week. So we have to the 100 city network, we're sending out a call to give us the projects where you need help. So we're asking the cities to self-identify their priorities, because again, coming back to the philosophy of like, we are here at the top of Manhattan, and we are a network of people around the world, but no one knows the problems like the cities themselves, who are like closest to it. And so we wanted to listen to them. We wanted to ask them what they needed help with. And then we have criteria of sort of how we're going to screen these things, and it's a mix of where do we think we can have the most impact, where can Columbia faculty and students help the most, is there a local knowledge institution that we can partner with? So one of the key elements of this program design is the city has to show up with a local partner that is a university, that is a knowledge institution, that will be our partners in developing this, and that will give us the capacity to do neighborhood level surveying, siting studies, like actually doing the on-the-ground research and develop a partnership. And our goal at the end of the day is not, as he said, to sort of helicopter and solve a problem and split. We want to leave institutional partnerships on the ground with the city so that there can continue to be this work happening over time. The other thing that I didn't get to mention in my remarks that's tied into this capacity building and institutional commitment bit is that we are starting to see centers like the one that Kate is starting pop up in universities all over this country and all over the world. So Tulane announced 2 weeks ago the Resilience Lab, which is a partnership between their Water Institute of the Gulf and Tulane, and it's going to this sort of very active quasi public but university but advising municipal and state decision-making stuff. Penn has a great initiative. I just read right before I got on stage that the Knight Foundation gave $1 million to Harvard GSD to work directly with Miami on a set of like SLR and design stuff. We want this center to ultimately grow to be a network of places around the world that are standing ready to help cities meet the challenge of the 21st century. So this center is one piece of that, but we hope to stitch this all together. It's one of the many new ways of working that we know this century needs. So I hope that helps.
Just to make a quick point too about one of the obvious roles for the university in terms of the evaluation of the strategies that are underway. So helping to build this baseline information in advance of extreme events, in advance of some of these resilient strategies, so that then either before or post-event, we can sort of look back and say which of these initiatives came in at cost, which had their intended objectives, which met their intended objectives, which didn't, but also testing some resilient strategies even beforehand, using, for example, coastal models to assess if you restore wetlands or mangroves, how does that potentially impact waves coming in if you put in more forest cover within it, more tree cover within a city. To what extent can that mitigate urban heat island? And then over time, we can sort of assess both whether the science is panning out the way we thought it would, but also, again, are these things coming in at cost? Are they having additional co-benefits that weren't anticipated, or in some cases, maybe co-costs? And whom I think that's one of the ways that the university and the center can contribute to things that are already underway in those regards.
That's great. I know we said 3 questions, but I also feel that I can see that the crowd really wants to get on to the second part of the evening, which is the reception. There's drinks here, and we'd really love for people to be able to hang around and talk to each other. So I just want to offer our panel any closing thoughts and takeaways from this evening. I learned a lot. Thank you. I did.
No.
I learned about Bugs
Well,
Bunny.
Yeah. No, I think it's just an expression right now. I can just feel an energy in the room, and I just think in its expression of Columbia really kind of stepping up and now and with the help from Rockefeller, for which we are very grateful. I feel like we are now somehow empowered really to take a much more direct step towards really transforming the way that Columbia operates, at least in this space, and really beginning to make a difference. So I'm happy about that.
Oh, I'm just excited to see this happen. So just stop with that.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank
Okay.
you all very
Thanks.
much. Thank you.